Welcome to episode number 20 of Eyes on Privacy. This week I'm joined by Josh Gillum and Keith Watson, and I'm Preston Wiley. And this week we're going to talk about something that has been in the news, major news, the last week or two. We're going to talk about what has been now called the shell shock bug or the bash bug or whatever you want to call it. I think it's been popularized as the shell shock bug. And basically, for those who aren't overly familiar with it, I guess it's also known as bash door, which that seems like a good name for it. It's a bug in Bash, which is a shell, which is basically the user interface to kind of to interact with the operating system on Linux-based, Unix-based, and there's Mac OS X systems that use it, and other systems that use it. Windows does not use it. So Windows was not, unless you're using Cygwin, and then which is a Linux-like environment for Windows. And basically, this vulnerability allowed it was pretty major. It allowed environment variables essentially to kind of blindly execute code on the operating system, which at first, when you first think about it, it's like, oh, well, that's not really that big of a deal. So if I'm logged in, I can set an environment variable and I can run code. But the impact was with it allowed for remote code execution in a few various scenarios, and probably the major one was with CGI scripts within web servers. There's the way that Apache, which is which I believe is the most popular web server on the internet, especially on Unix and Linux-based systems. Apache pretty much uses environment variables for storing lots of things, including some user input that it would get from like the address the user's coming from, and the user agent that a user is using, and things like that. And using that functionality, it was fairly straightforward for an attacker to attack a CGI script that would execute Bash. Essentially, you set something and then Bash runs it as the context of the web server, which could then compromise pretty much every single page on the web server. So that's bad. That's bad. But it also had impact on SSH, and there was also, I guess, an impact on DHCP. Basically, anything that you could somehow trick to run a Bash the Bash shell to execute code, you could essentially, and if you could inject environment variables into the system, then you could execute code in the context of the running Bash shell. So that's bad. Now the vulnerability was made public, and it was fixed fairly quickly after it was made public. But Linux and Mac OS and all those operating systems are pretty popular on the internet. So there were a lot of users affected, and this bug existed for decades. So there's a lot of significant impact, and probably some unpatchable systems on the internet. Potentially, it could exist in embedded systems and things like that as well. Unsupported systems that can't get patches necessarily, and things like that. And the bug, when it was first patched, wasn't the first patch wasn't a complete fix. The second patch wasn't a complete fix. The third patch wasn't a complete. It took 6 patches, I believe, before people were comfortable with saying maybe it's fixed, but I'm still not sure if people are comfortable with saying, yeah, it's 100% fixed. I'm guessing there's several, probably dozen, maybe 100 of security researchers just combing through the code looking for any more problems that could be there. Um, this has been compared to the Heartbleed vulnerability, which we talked about previously, and a lot of people are saying it's much worse than that, from just the ease of exploiting the vulnerability and the just the impact that it could have in the internet as a whole. So we're talking about that, and I think that was a decent summary. So we'll get some more discussion going about this and get the two of you, your opinions.
Well, this has been a fun week of patch and repatch again, and the issue is kind of fun, sort of, in that the way CGI works for systems that still use CGI, any header strings that are part of your request or what do I call them? Header information that is passed as part of your request, like user agent, for example, get passed to that CGI script as an environment variable. And the issue when you create this anonymous function is that it doesn't terminate execution of code after you've defined the function, and that's where you can execute that code in the string. So when you're passing a user agent, you've got this fairly sophisticated looking code. When it gets passed off to that CGI script, that's when it gets executed inside the context of an environment variable. So much like what Preston described, that's a lot of fun. The issue was originally put in the code in version 1.13 in 1992. That's how long this bug has existed in the code. It's the original issue that was discovered. That's a long time for a bug. I don't know if it's the longest ever, but certainly this one took a while to find. I mean, Heartbleed was a concern, and that bug was almost 2 years old. So do the math, it's a long time. So one of the couple of things that we've done at our facility is look for patterns in which we see people attempting to execute or test or probe servers looking for this problem. And there's a lot of it. And so we got an IPS signature that we were able to plug into the IPS system and actually capture HTTP-based requests, and started blocking those once we were fairly certain that we're not blocking anything that was not a legitimate attack or a probe. And so it's interesting to see the variation on what the attackers are trying. And so a lot of times you'd see code that would basically just echo a command to just see if it got any output indicating that the system was vulnerable. And some of them would actually try to ping a remote system, and that system would sit there and wait for incoming pings so it could tell which servers at which IP addresses were actually vulnerable. That was unique. A couple of them actually tried to download exploit code from a remote site and then execute it. And we saw a variety of stuff that was compiled code, which is kind of hard because you don't know what the target system is going to be running. But we saw a lot of Perl scripts and some other attack codes similar to that. So that was also interesting to see. The problem with the IPS signature is we don't see the HTTPS side of it, so that we still could see a lot of, or we'd be missing a lot of those probes because they come over an encrypted channel, which the IPS cannot see. And we try to supplement that by looking at log files and actually looking at requests, so we can see people actually requesting something that has these strings in it. So it's been fun. We believe we patched most everything, and we should be okay, but you always, like Preston mentioned, there's embedded systems that may not easily be patched or updated or even supported. And Bash is a common shell in a lot of different systems, and some vendors were very slow to provide patches, and in some cases I know that the administrators actually went out and compiled their own version of Bash that had the correction in it and replaced the vendor version. So there's some of that going on as well. Hopefully we'll start to see a lot of these probing attempts start to go down, but even we still see probe attempts for bugs that are decades old now still running. So who knows? This may be going on for quite a while.
To me, it sort of brings up the old question, which also falls into the same question that was for Heartbleed, is the open source environment where people say, oh, everyone gets to look at the code, audit the code, and find any vulnerabilities in the code. Well, to me, raises the question of how often is that being done, onto what type of level, when this has been out there for 20 years without anyone knowing. And I know recently, I think it was Linux Foundation that had $6 or $20 million that they were doing security audits with, but decided not to put Bash on that list of audits or items that needed to be audited. So
sure, and that's common thinking, because generally when you think of vulnerabilities that are remotely exploitable, you're thinking about servers, you're thinking about web servers, you're thinking about DHCP servers, you're thinking about anything that provides a service that somebody might want to send bad input to. Would you think that a shell would be a problem? No. I mean, most people would think, well, the shell is the command line interpreter. I type my commands into it and something happens, or I write a script that runs in it. You don't think of that shell being potentially used as a means to exploit a system remotely. And usually that's because you kind of, when you're thinking of the dependencies, the shell doesn't pop to the surface as, oh yeah, that's a critical part of a CGI program. Most of the CGI, a lot of CGI was written in Perl or something like that. So you're like, well, it's Perl, it's not Bash. But you forget that the interpreter is still part of that process of kicking off the whole Perl process. So it's not one that would automatically come to mind as something we needed to audit. Now it does, but up until 2 weeks ago, no, not really.
So all the other shell tools, I wonder if those are getting fine-combed right now to see if there's anything vulnerable on them.
Could be. The issue that comes here is that Bash is the default shell in most Linux systems. And when you're the default shell, that's the shell that gets used for these kind of handoffs processes, if you will. Like in the case of CGI, usually on another type of system, a commercial Unix system, it might be bin.sh. And bin.sh is pretty much bare bones when it comes to shell. Bash is like a super shell. It's got a lot of features that your standard shells from commercial Linux or Unix systems wouldn't have. And so you get a lot of functionality in that shell, and it's the default shell. And so the default shells are kind of unique on Unix systems for that reason.
Okay.
So no, I don't want to rule out that there isn't a possibility that there's a similar problem with the bin.sh tools and the other default shells. I'm sure there are people looking at that to see if that is a problem. But given that this is a unique problem to Bash at this point, I don't know that we'll see this similar type of bug in other shells, but we'll rule it out.
Right, and technically with CGI, you can pretty much use any shell that's installed on the machine to execute your code.
Yeah,
so
yeah. I mean,
the
interpreter. You're right. The interpreter can be written in anything. It could be written in Bash. It could be written in Perl. It could be written in any scripting language, really. And that's kind of the problem with CGI. Its flexibility was also its downfall. You might notice that Apache ships with a lot of, or not a lot, but I think it ships with at least 2 default CGI tools, and mostly they're tools that show you the environment. So I think one at one point was called printenv, and when you ran that, it would print out the environment variables that were passed to it. So you could look at user agent, you can look at different, you can say, I want to know what the environment is when I start writing code for it, and that was a tool that would show you that. And then there was another one, maybe it was test CGI, and it did something else. But they were like very simple example programs almost, or diagnostic programs. Not a lot of code is written in CGI these days. Most of it's written in web frameworks, which operate differently. But there's still a lot of default CGI still floating around there because they ship with Apache. Usually our recommendations on the security side is like, well, you don't use it, take it off. You don't want to put any tool or program out there that's not actually critical to the operation of whatever you're trying to do. and CGI always seemed a little flaky, and so that would be a good reason to get rid of it. But some people install the default and they leave all that stuff in thinking they need it, or they're not sure if they should get rid of it. So.
Yeah, and I think Keith pointed out, and I think this is important. Is in the news I saw a lot of I don't know if I call it bashing, no pun intended, of Apple about not patching as quickly as very quickly and kind of being somewhat silent about it. But this issue has mainly to do with servers. And while Apple and Mac OS X was vulnerable, it was only vulnerable if you essentially ran services and had your firewall turned off, and if you had Apache enabled and CGI enabled, and you had external SSH enabled or whatever. So for the most part, end users who just use their computers to surf the web and stuff like that weren't even close to as vulnerable as like a web server or an SSH server would have been.
Right, and those are off by default on the standard Mac install, and most users are unlikely to enable that because they don't know what it is, and do you see an average Mac user using SSH? No, not an average one. No, that's not a tool they would normally use. So. Apple did issue a patch, I think, 2 days ago. The last I checked, though, it didn't show up in software update. You had to go and manually download the package. But it wasn't.
So one thing that I also haven't heard of is I think technically Android is built on top of Linux as well. So I haven't heard anything about if Android's vulnerable.
It most likely
or
is.
Anything like that. So.
But again, you're going back to what services does it run that could be remotely exploited.
Right. Well,
so we had a couple.
I mean, that's true.
We had a couple. We had a couple vendor notices that listed some systems as vulnerable but not exploitable. And so yes, they had Bash running on them, but they didn't offer up any external services in which you could exploit that problem remotely. So vulnerable but not exploitable term has come about for that reason.
Is that mainly going to be on your phone, like all the different apps that the app itself is reaching out to the server to grab, updated information and then bringing it back to you, and that the server itself couldn't go to your phone and push information? It has to get that request from the mobile device. Does that make any sense?
No, that didn't make any sense.
Okay, so
well, I don't think Android's vulnerable because it doesn't use Bash to do its thing. Now, if you rooted your phone, then all bets are off.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I believe the shell that does come by default is a fairly limited shell, but I don't remember if it was a Bash derivative or something written specifically for Android or not. I don't recall. But you're right, yeah, if you root your phone, who knows what you'll get. You might have a Bash shell somewhere. But was your question, Josh, related to how you would exploit an Android phone?
No, I guess it was more going to be the fact that as your applications that you're running on your mobile phone are usually talking to a server, like a lot of my apps, like my weather app, automatically gets me new updated information without me having to do anything. But it's not that it's really running server functions on my side.
No,
it's just reaching out to the server to grab that piece of data and bring it back to me. The server can't push information to me without me requesting it. Well, I guess depending, but I think most of them are set up there.
More or less. But even the data you get, the data you get is validated in some way, you hope. And so that's less likely. It's possible, certainly. Poorly written apps that receive invalid data crash because they don't check input correctly, and that sometimes is exploitable, depending on what you send it. But it does mean that your Android phone could be used to try to probe web servers for shell shock vulnerabilities. So there's always that. The other, yeah, you were talking about headlines. I thought the best evening news headline I saw was that the internet has a new bug and it's known as Bash. I'm like, what? It's like, yeah, leave it up to the news media to come up with a really lousy headline. That was pretty bad.
Well, I think this is one of those bugs that's kind of going to go down as if you haven't been compromised, you will eventually be compromised, and it's going to probably be in the standard attack toolkit of pretty much every single attacker out there. So
yeah, that's why
there's just those bugs that have been around for over 10 years that there's still things scanning for them. And every once in a while you see this scan for like an SQL vulnerability that's existed for over 10 years that is still getting scanned for, and I think this might be one of those that is going to go within that pile.
Right. Yeah, you'll probably see a lot of, if you use a web application firewall, and this is one of those rules that you have there, it's probably going to trigger quite often for a while, for the long haul. Probably one of those you're going to just say, I that one. So.
Yeah,
so
I think the ease of exploitation of this is so easy to exploit. I mean that it's just so simple to find that it's not. I mean, Heartbleed was bad, but it wasn't quite that simple to exploit. This one is just, I mean, it's just probably a one-line piece of code, and there you go.
Well, it's even easier that you can run a curl statement. So you can a command line tool called curl, which is used to interact with web servers. You can pass curl in one command line. You can launch an attack against a server. It's that easy. So.
Right. It's very easy. I mean, as it got patched, I think it became a little bit more and more difficult. So if you installed, the first few patches, then you're a little bit safer, but you still want to patch all the way up to, current.
Correct. And kind of bring this discussion, which is really about a security vulnerability, back to privacy. We put a lot of information on these web servers, whether that be personal information or there's access that the server has to databases of information about us. And this is one of those things you got to watch out for your vendor that you're using to see, are they up to date? Are they making sure they're getting patches out? Are they talking about it? A lot of places they don't talk about it. You don't know what they're doing. And some places are very open about their processes and whether they've discovered what the problem, that they've corrected it. And so it's one of those things you just got to keep a wary eye open for whatever online services you're using, just to make sure they're keeping up on their security practices. So when these vulnerabilities do come out, they are on the ball and fixing them fast. So.
Right, and ultimately, I would say that the summary of this vulnerability is if you are vulnerable, you essentially anybody can get a remote shell to your machine, your vulnerable machine. That's essentially what the vulnerability allows.
Yes, and how far they can get with that, because most web servers run at a lower permission set. Yeah, they still have access. And popping a shell on a server is usually a bad sign.
Right, they can view anything on the system that the web server would be allowed to view. So even if it was not in web accessible locations, including passwords to your database and things like that. Yep. So there's a lot of impact.
Yep. And if you're a server admin, make sure you're patched up to date. But also, if you're not using CGI, rip it out. Take it out. Don't use it. Okay, end of rant.
And according to Cloudflare, 5 days after the vulnerability was was announced, they were tracking approximately 1.5 million attacks and probes per day related to the bug.
And to add to that, I think it was InfoWorld that had 30 to 50% of all web servers worldwide run either Linux, Unix, or OS X, and of those machines, nearly 100% of them were vulnerable or exploitable.
I'd push back on that claim a little bit, but
You think there's a lot more IIS?
no, I think the claim that every web server was vulnerable, yes, in the sense that they ran bash somewhere in the system is true, but were they exploitable?
Because there was firewalls and other
Well, could be prevented by a web application firewall, could be by simply removing.
Yeah, there'd also have to be a CGI script.
Yeah,
that
if
ran
you
bash.
remove CGI or some other interpreted language system that has a bash shell as an intermediary, and you can push data to it. I would push back on that claim that everyone was vulnerable. It's more important if they're exploitable.
Okay.
That's my opinion, at least. You can be vulnerable, but can you be exploitable too? And if you are, then you're in a world of hurt. But it's an easy fix if you get it patched, no problem. You can also recompile the shell. I mean, there's lots of ways around this. So, yes, it's bad, but it can be fixed. So, it's not like having a bug for which there is no patch available. That's a bad bug. Especially when it's
unless you have if you have embedded systems or whatever that
well, that's true. From that perspective, that is true.
I mean, there could be some bad things out there that are exploitable. Like, I mean, I could think of like security cameras that have IP cameras that have Linux on them, and have CGIs, and you can't really update those. Things like that it could potentially be vulnerable. So
that's true.
And what do? I guess you buy a new camera.
My side rant about aren't those easy hackable anyways, or there's ones that they require the password to view the contents?
Well, yeah, that's happened.
That's a side rant.
So, but I think that's mainly setup versus vulnerabilities. But anyway, I think that we've talked about that quite a bit. So is there anything else that we should mention before we sign off?
Well, go patch your systems.
Yes, go patch your systems if you haven't done so already. And Apple has released an update for macOS 10. I'm not sure if it actually is an automatic update or within the software update system, but it definitely is one that you can download and install. I'm not sure if it's included in the Apple Store when you go to updates. I'm not sure if it'll be listed there. So at least it wasn't a few days ago. So anyway, thank you to Josh Gillum and Keith Watson. I'm Preston Wiley, and keep your eyes on privacy.